Okay, we are in part 19 tonight. And so tonight's it's a really good study as we are looking into the book of Zechariah. We are in chapter 11 tonight, and we're looking at verses 1 through 11. I apologize, I can't do the whole study, the whole chapter in one study. I'm going to have to divide it into two. There is so much to cover, and we're going to cover a lot in these 11 verses tonight. So just stay tuned, and we'll be back with you for part 20 next week. And by the way, it's going to be a good one, really good. So I hope you can make it next week as well. Okay. So yeah, I'll just turn this down. All right. So here's the introduction. So much has been covered already in this first message. So remember, the first message, which is the first of the final messages, there's actually two burdens that the book of Zechariah closes with. The first burden is from chapter 9 to 11. The second burden is from chapter 12 to 14. And let me tell you, the best is yet to come. To say that the Lord does not unfold history in advance and warn the world of his judgments or his blessings and even their future history is preposterous. God lives in eternity. He needs no time machine to know how things will be. It takes some study, though, to understand the meanings of the prophecy that we're looking at tonight and we've been looking at. But if we do our homework, what unfolds is almost too amazing to comprehend. So I'd like to do a review because we are in the first of the two final burdens, chapters 9 through 11. And so I'd like to do a little review to see what we have seen in the first two parts of Zechariah's first on the final burdens. Okay, so what we found is, and this is in chapter 9, the ancient nations will end, that there will be ancient nations that will end, namely Syria, Phoenicia along the Mediterranean coast, Philistia, or the Philistines. Although the remnant of Philistines will flee as refugees and be taken in by Israel, this takeover is due to the military campaign of terror of a historical figure, Alexander the Great. This is what it refers to. And okay, so now Alexander will come to Jerusalem and even return and will not harm them. He will leave the Israelis in peace. And so we find that that's another one of the prophecies that we looked at and fulfilled. Here's another prophecy that was fulfilled. Messiah will come to Jerusalem in peace upon a foal of a donkey, in humility and peace. So this is chapter 9, and that's found in verse 9, and I preached a message on it last Sunday. And then also Messiah will come again and unite Israel to fight with him in the final world battle known as the Battle of Armageddon. We find that it doesn't last just 1 hour, it's just this is going to take days. And then he will set up his kingdom and rule forever upon the earth. Interesting little picture there. Here's another fulfillment. A wicked Seleucid king, a Greek Seleucid leader named Antiochus Epiphanes will rise up and defile the temple. He'll offer a statue of Zeus and put it in the Temple Mount. He will sacrifice a pig upon the brazen altar and thus cause this Maccabean revolt. And then at the end, the Seleucids of Syria would end. It would be the end of them. And then Israel would live in days of prosperity for a time before the coming of the Romans. So that's really what chapter 9 is about. Then we get to chapter 10, and the people will turn to shepherds or leaders who are comfortless and false. This is what happens. Israel eventually starts going apostate. setting the scene for the Roman takeover and the coming of Christ. And this will cause Messiah to visit his people in anger. And we will learn more about this in chapter 11. And we will. Messiah will come as the cornerstone. We talked about that, different Old Testament types, the tent peg or the nail in the sure place, the battle bow, and the oppressor of the evildoers. Those are 4 references to the coming of Christ, what he'll be like, the character references. We see reference in chapter 10 of Christ's second coming. One thing we notice is that the prophecy is not chronologically aligned. That's why it can be very, very confusing and difficult to interpret. So it takes careful interpretation to come to the conclusions that we have studied. This is not easy. This is very difficult to put it together, because you'll go into the way in the future, then it'll come back into the present, or it'll go into a few years to come, or 100 years or 200 years, or even longer than that, come to 500 years to the coming of Christ. It just goes back and forth. It doesn't follow a kind of a chronological basis like what we study many times in history books. Through the second coming of Messiah, the nation of Israel will become a superpower and will fight alongside him. So this is the final battle, the Battle of Armageddon. And the Bible tells us, Zechariah tells us, that what will happen is the nation Israel will fight alongside the second coming of Christ. They will actually become a superpower even after that, and when Christ comes and establishes his kingdom upon the earth. And they will rejoice in the victory won. It will inherit the kingdom of Christ, and he will bless them just as he brought them out of Egypt and delivered them from the hand of their masters as slaves. He will do it again. So you had those you got the Red Sea miracle. You've got the miracle of the Jordan River when they went across with Joshua. And he's going to do it again. He's going to do things like this again, because you see, the Battle of Armageddon is a miraculous thing. It's not in the normal. It's supernatural. I mean, Christ coming on a white horse from heaven, I wouldn't call that natural. I would definitely call that supernatural. And so he will do it again. There are miracles to come. The age of miracles is not over. We think, oh, well, that was in the past and there won't be any miracles in the future. How wrong you are. The age of miracles is not over. God will work and bless his people. And I say, wow. Yet we are not through. There is much more to be said. So we're going to go into it now. And we're looking at verses 1 through 3. So Zechariah 11, verses 1 through 3. Open thy doors, O Lebanon, that the fire may devour thy cedars. Howl, fir tree, for the cedar is fallen, because the mighty are spoiled. Howl, O ye oaks of Bashan, for the forest of the vintage is come down. There is a voice of the howling of the shepherds, for their glory is spoiled. A voice of the roaring of the young lions, for the pride of Jordan is spoiled. What is this about? Well, this is a reference of the Roman campaign to destroy the land. So if you'll notice, if you go to verse 1 there, it says, open thy doors, O Lebanon. So that's where the campaign obviously begins. The Romans would come down, or they would bring their ships to Lebanon. They would start in Lebanon, and that would be the doorway for their campaign. And then they start this scorched earth policy, where they burn the forests of Lebanon, and then the people down south of them in Israel start hearing about this, and so already they are mourning, they're howling. It doesn't mean like howling to the moon. It means great grief. When somebody is howling, what this is referring to is somebody in a terrible, terrible, bitter grief. They're crying out loud. They're bitter from the situation that is about to fall on them. And so that's what it's saying here. And so he likens it to trees here. The cedars are being devoured by the fire. Now the fir tree to the south in Israel is becoming very, very fearful and grieving because there's judgment coming. The cedar is fallen. They heard the story. They've heard the reports. People have come down already. Posts have come down to give them the story of what's happening, that the Romans are here and they are causing great destruction. And it says, the cedar is fallen because the mighty are spoiled, and spoiled means looted. So the Romans would go in, just like any great army would go in those ancient times. Their pay was to take away the loot for themselves. So they would go into the homes and the castles and the fortresses, and they would just take whatever they wanted, and that was their pay. And so they're all spoiled. And then it says, "Howl, O ye oaks of Bashan." And that's another location. That's over the River Jordan. So that's to the east. It's actually to the northeast. But really what it's referring to is the eastern area north of the River Jordan. And then it says, "For the forest of the vintage has come down. There's a voice of the howling of the shepherds." They're all really, really upset. And the shepherds is referring to the leaders of Israel. Their glory is spoiled. A voice of roaring among the young lions is the Romans. For the pride of the Jordan is spoiled. So this is referring to the campaign where they're moving south. They're taking the land. They're bringing devastation to every city. Anything in their path, it's basically a scorched earth policy. They're going to burn everything they can, which demoralizes a country, but it also weakens the area. It prevents them to build the siege engines to fight back because they burned all the trees. So there's no way they can build anything to defend themselves. The Romans would have all that. And then this would cause this bitter and loud crying and grief, this howling that Zechariah is prophesying. And so you notice there are three areas. It begins with Lebanon. Then the fir trees to the south begin to mourn because their turn is next. Then you've got the oaks of Bashan, which is the land east of Jordan, and they're included in the scorched earth policy set up by the Romans. The pride of the Jordan is spoiled. It's just spoiled, everything. And so this is a figure of speech saying that the length and breadth of the land is destroyed. The Romans will come and they will destroy. And the Bible prophesies of the Romans that they crush anything in their way. Anything that comes along, or whenever they come along to something, they'll just destroy it. And so by this, there is a great grieving of the people. And there's this roaring of the young lions. And so the young lions, of course, are beasts of prey, and they're very powerful because they're young and they got a lot of power. And so that's the idea of that. And this is referring to the Romans. They're the young lions that are roaring away. And then the doors and the devouring cedars of Lebanon may also give reference to the Romans destroying the temple in Jerusalem, which was destroyed in AD 70. So this is actually referring to that time when the Romans came down. They were very angry and they just started to destroy everything in their path. And they ended up at the temple in Jerusalem. And you have cedars of Lebanon that they used to rebuild that temple. And so they're destroyed, and he talks about doors. So devouring cedars, is this a reference to the temple in Jerusalem? Well, it very likely is. We do know that it was destroyed by the Romans. So there's a prophecy right there about the Romans taking over the land of Canaan. So that's what that's referring to. Now we're in verse 4, and we're just going to look at that first part, just verse 4 now. "Thus saith the Lord my God, feed the flock of the slaughter." So Zechariah here is prophesying in the first person as Jehovah. So he's speaking for Jehovah. Jehovah's using his voice to speak. And he's "thus saith the Lord my God." And he's so the covenant God, and of course you see the capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. That's the covenant God of Israel, which is Jehovah. And I preached a message Sunday talking about that. When you use that name, he better be your covenant God. And if he's not your covenant God, you can't use that name. And Israel had a covenant God, and he told him, he says, you can call me Jehovah. You can call me Jehovah because I'm your God. And that's there. And what we see here, though, is the Father commissioning his Son. So actually what you're seeing there in that verse is that the Father is speaking to the Son, and he's commanding him, he's commissioning him to feed the flock of the slaughter. Wow, the flock of the slaughter. Well, Christ came as the feeding shepherd of Israel, but his message and mission was rejected. He came on his own. What happened? His own received him not. So what happened? Because of that rejection of Christ, slaughter ultimately became Israel's destiny. So they became the flock of the slaughter. And were they slaughtered? Yes, they were slaughtered by the Romans over their sin of rejection from God, from the Lord Jesus Christ. Because of their sin of rejection, they became this flock of the slaughter. That's what that is referring to. And it's interesting because Josephus records that approximately 1.5 million Jews died at the hands of Rome. So yes, the people that were in Jesus's day are in reference there as the flock of the slaughter. Interesting. Now, verse 5, we're going to continue on with this theme. So he says, feed the flock of the slaughter, whose possessors slay them and hold themselves not guilty, and they that sell them say, blessed be the Lord, for I am rich, and their own shepherds pitying them not. Now, this is actually when it says whose possessors slay them, possessors being the Romans. The Romans are going to take over. And so after they destroyed the temple, then even years later, when the Jews revolted again about AD 100, just a little bit after that, they finally came down, and that they'd had enough. The Romans had had enough, and they are the possessors, and they just started killing the Jews. They were so angry, and so they started to kill them. And then they said, well, we're not guilty for this. Just like you would take a flock to the slaughterhouse and you wouldn't be feeling guilty. And so it says here, let's just look at the note here. I've got it right here. So just as the sheep are led into the slaughterhouse and killed, the Romans will likewise feel guiltless in the destruction of the Jews. They're not going to feel guilty at all. To them, it's going to be relegated to like taking a sheep to the slaughterhouse. That's how they're going to feel. It's not very good, is it? How terrible that is. And so it's a terrible judgment awaiting the people through their Christ rejection and handing themselves over to their Roman conquerors. That was not a good idea. And you're going to see that tonight, because I'm going to go into a few New Testament passages which refers to the Jews, and I'm talking about the nation of Israel, actually handing themselves over to the Romans. Not a good idea. Even the slave traders of the Romans will hypocritically credit God for their ill-gotten gain. You see that? It says, and they that sell them say, blessed be the Lord, for I am rich. They're saying, well, God made me rich. And they're actually blasphemously and hypocritically crediting God for their ill-gotten gain. That's just awful. Notice also the phrase, their own shepherds pitying them not. This is also there in verse 5. This is a reference to the leaders, the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. We read about them in the Gospels. Well, what did they do? Well, they hightailed it for the hills and left the people holding everything And the Romans came along and they just started slaughtering them. So they didn't care about the people. They didn't care about their nation. They were hirelings, as Christ talked about that. They just came and they were making money from them, and they didn't care about them. And so they'd rather look after themselves than their nation. And so Christ gave warning to these people. And he did. Let me show you. So Luke 23, and you might want to write down these references, verse 27 through 31. And there followed him. This is where Jesus is going to Calvary. He's going to go to Golgotha and be crucified. And as he's on his way, the book of Luke records, and only the book of Luke records this, and there followed him a great company of people and of women, which also bewailed and lamented him. But Jesus, turning unto them, said, Daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. So this is very recent. You see that? For behold, the days are coming. So there's going to come a day for you in which they shall say, Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bear and the paps which never gave suck. So it was better that nobody was born than to go through this time that you're about to go through. This is what Jesus is saying to them. Then shall they begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things in a green tree, what shall they do in the dry? And so Christ is referring to something that was soon going to happen to these people, to this nation. And history tells us this diaspora did happen. And Jesus is giving them prophecy. He's telling them, you're going to say, it would be better that we didn't have children than to go through this. And you're going to say to the mountains, please fall on us. Please cover us. We don't want to go through this. This is a terrible time. And it was coming to the nation by the Romans. Matthew 23, verse 37 and 38. Jesus is looking over Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, and he starts to cry out, doesn't he? And he cries out and he says, Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them that are sent unto thee. How often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathereth her chickens under her wings, and you would not. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. And it's an interesting phrase. We're going to come back to that last phrase. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. He's saying something there. He's saying something there to these people. Now we're in verse 6. So go back to Zechariah chapter 11, verse 6. For I will no more pity the inhabitants of the land, saith the Lord. But lo, I will deliver the men, everyone to his neighbor's hand, and into the hand of his king. It's an interesting phrase there. We'll get to that. And they shall smite the land, and out of their hand I will not deliver them. Wow, that's not good. That's a curse. And kind of goes along with our verse here. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. So that is a fascinating verse, and I'm going to give you the interpretation of that. It's terrible, though. I have to warn you, it's really terrible for these people. Being delivered into the neighbor's hand is likely a reference to King Herod. Now, Herod was Idumean. That's Latin for Edomite. He was an Edomite. He was half and half, really. His father was a full Edomite or an Idumean. The son, Herod the Great, was half and half. And so they had Jewish in their bloodline, but they were very, very pro-Edomite or Idumean. So that's a reference to the neighbor, okay? But notice the next phrase, because remember the Herodians were actually puppets of the Roman regime. The Romans had given them their power and seat and authority. In fact, in such a way that even when Herod the Great died, the kingdom was divided into four, and given to the sons, because the son of Herod, he reigned for 9 years and did a terrible job. And so he was deposed by the Romans, and they divided into 4 different areas. Okay, so they were under the Roman dominion, even in those days. But notice what it says in verse 6, and it says, into the hand of his king. And I find this fascinating because this is a reference, and it's kind of, in a way, I would almost say, be a little bit sarcastic. If you the way it's put here, his king. So it's into the hand of his king, which is a reference to Caesar. But I put this in here for you. This is John 19, verse 15. And you may remember this, but if you don't, this is where this reference is brought to. But they cried out, and this is when Jesus is being tried, and he's standing before Pilate, and he's made his judgment, and they said, away with him, crucify him. And Pilate said unto them, shall I crucify your king? And the chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. Oh, that's a terrible declaration. That became their undoing. God heard that. In fact, he even prophesied that they would say this. And it's right there in Zechariah 11, verse 6. Into the hand of his king. You do not want to put your hand into the hand of the Romans, Mr. Israel. You don't want to do that. And they did this terrible declaration in John 19, verse 15. This became their epitaph. It really did. And that they would be destroyed like sheep. The Romans would become terrible and cruel taskmasters and cause great suffering among the people, the diaspora. How terrible that is. Verse 7 now. And I will feed the flock of slaughter, even you, O poor of the flock. And I took unto me 2 staves, the one I called beauty, and the other I called bands, and I fed the flock. By the way, if you're wondering who this person is speaking right here, that's Christ. That's Christ in the Old Testament. If you go back to verse 1, you'll see that he passed it on, that the Father passed it on to the Son. And then the Son received this mission of feeding the flock of the slaughter. So in verse 7, he's confessing. He says, I'll do that. I'm going to take that commission. So Christ is continuing his confession. You can literally, I mean, they could put the words right there in verse 7 in red. You can put the other verses. There's verses in there that he's literally speaking. Christ is speaking in the Old Testament right there. Very interesting. So he continues his confession. He will feed the flock. But it changes here. He will go after the poor of the flock. Did you see that? He says, oh, okay, I'll feed the flock, even you. But he says, oh, poor of the flock. And that's really the ministry of Jesus, isn't it? He went after the poor. He was the shepherd of the poor of Israel, of the ordinary people, and they received him. The fishermen, the tax collector, people that were just the despised people, the poor people, the people that were looked down on, the people that were castigated, the people that were hated. They were the ones that Jesus gave his ministry to him, because they will receive him. And that's the ministry of Jesus. He went after the common and ordinary. In Acts chapter 4, verse 13, when Peter and John were standing before the Sanhedrin, it said, verse 13, it says, and when they saw, this is the leaders of the Sanhedrin, their government, they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were unlearned and ignorant men. They marveled, and they took knowledge of them that they had been with Jesus. So Christ went to the poor of the flock, didn't he? That was his ministry. And there you find it there in verse number 7. But we also notice 2 staves. Now, those are staffs. Staves or staffs. That's what they are. So you can put staff there if you'd like, because that's what it is. Now, one was to protect the sheep from wild animals. That's usually what they did in the Middle East. They would carry these 2 staffs. And one was to protect the sheep from wild animals, and the other was to help the sheep in difficult and dangerous places. And they'd had that crook on there. I guess those are the ones that they would help and kind of get them away from a cliff or through a narrow valley or something like that, that maybe they could slip and fall to their death or something like that. They had these staves or staffs to help them. Now they are named. There are two staffs or staves, and they are named. One's named Beauty, and the Hebrew means pleasantness, favor, or graciousness. You can also say grace. All right, it's beautiful. And the other is called bands or bonds or binders, one that unifies. That's the idea of bands. So the beauty is grace and favor and pleasantness, that God's going to be gracious to his people and favorable to his people and pleasant to his people. That's really good. Beauty's great. Then the other one is bands, and that's just talking about the unity of the people, that God's going to keep them together. And so he's got these two staffs. So Jesus is coming, and this is part of his ministry. He's going to carry two staffs. Now, of course, he's not carrying them literally. This is a spiritual thing, but that's the idea. So by this, Messiah was to draw the nation of Israel to himself. So this is as their Messiah. Jesus came as their king. He was born as their king, and they did not receive him, but this is his ministry. His ministry was to come to the people of Israel and to draw them to himself. He was sent to feed the flock as a shepherd. That's the idea. And unfortunately, they're called the flock of the slaughter because they're not going to receive him. But look at, now listen to this. This is Matthew 15, verse 24. And this is what Jesus said, and this is what he confessed. And he answered and said, I am not sent, but unto the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So this was his ministry. Jesus never really left Israel. He was either in the area of Israel. I mean, I know he went into Decapolis and he went up to Caesarea and all that, but he did stay within his area, into his territory. Now let's look at verse 8. Now this is a very difficult verse, and a lot of different opinion about this verse of who these three shepherds are or were. And I'm going to give you an idea what I think they might be, although the Bible is not really too clear about these shepherds, but I think we can pretty well put it together, because there's some interesting points here in this verse. So let me give it to you. 3 shepherds also I cut off in 1 month. So that means after it, I don't think he means literally a month. I think he means within a short time. And my soul loathed them, and their soul also abhorred me. So in order to fulfill this, these shepherds have to be leaders of Israel, guides of Israel at the time of Jesus. And they're going to lose their authority, and he doesn't like them, and they don't like him. He said, actually, he's not saying he doesn't like them. He says he loathes them. He loathes them, and they abhorred him. Okay, so it's a little bit different. He's not really disliking them as such, but he doesn't really like their company. Okay, I guess that's what you mean when you're loathing somebody. And then their soul is just abhorring. He disgusts me and all that. And this is how they feel about Christ. So there are doubts of who these shepherds might be, as they were obviously, they would be during the ministry. They would obviously be during the ministry of Christ. And there were 3 kinds of Israeli leaders in his day. So let's talk about the different leaders of the day of Christ. There were the Herodians. Were they friends of Jesus's? No. The Sadducees? Not at all. Many of those were the priests of the temple. A lot of the priests were Sadducees. And then you have the Pharisees of the Sanhedrin, which was the government of the day. And so their services did shortly end after coming. So after his coming, the 1 month is like saying in a short time. they're going to end because I loathe them. I cut them off in 1 month. And that did happen. Some of Christ's sharpest messages, I mean, we don't have time to really get into, but if you go into Matthew the 23, I mean, he really, that's one of the sharpest messages I've ever read in the Bible, to say Christ to preach direct and sharp messages, or he never did. Oh, he always did. It seemed like he always did. And here you have this sharp message against these three Israeli leaders, the three different groups. And they were all very happy to hand Christ over to the Romans. So they didn't like him, they abhorred him. And I don't think he really wanted to be around them either. So there you have it. Verse 9, that's what I think that verse 8 means, but let's go to verse 9. Then said I will not feed you that dieth, let it die. And that is cut off, let it be cut off. And let the rest eat every one the flesh of another. Interesting verse. What's that mean? Well, this is a curse that is put on these Christ rejecting leaders. So remember, you're talking about the three shepherds in verse 8, and they are obviously leaders of Israel. And I think they're the three groups. You got the Herodians, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees. So how are you going to do this? How are you going to cut them off? And he says, okay, well, they're just not going to be fed. I says, I'm not going to feed you. And that's what he did. He didn't really feed these leaders. Some of them came to the Lord. You've got Joseph of Arimathea. You've got Nicodemus. They did come to the Lord. You have Apostle Paul later on. He was a Pharisee, but not a lot of them would come to the Lord. Many of them rejected him completely. And so he says, that's fine. There are three forms of judgment that are decried against them. So the first one is famine. So that dieth, let it die. Just let it die. Famine. And then it says that which is cut off, or that is cut off. So that's a reference to the sword. Somebody dying an untimely death would very likely be in battle. So this is referring to warfare. And then the third one is very interesting. And let the rest eat everyone the flesh of another. And so this is internal strife where they're going after each other, kind of like politicians do. They're just going at each other, and they're tearing each other apart, and they're hurting each other's, however you want to put it. And so in a way, symbolically speaking, they're sort of eating the flesh of each other because there's internal strife. And he says, okay, we'll just let them eat. They'll just let them fight among themselves. Let them die in warfare or die in famine, but I am not going to help those folks. They are on their own. And that's what it means. That's what it points to. Now we're in verse 10. We're getting close to the end. And I took my staff, even beauty, and cut it asunder, that I might break my covenant, which I had made with all the people. Now remember, beauty was referring to, let's go back to that just for a moment. It refers to pleasantness, favor, and graciousness. So the idea of it is that I'm going to be good to you. I'm going to be gracious to you. I'm going to be favorable to you. But now he's saying, I'm going to cut that off. I'm going to cut it asunder. And he's got a covenant. He made a covenant with these people. And so he says, now that covenant's over. Isn't that what Christ said? Remember, I told you earlier that I'd come back to that phrase, behold, your house is left unto you desolate. Can Christ say that? Yes. Is that the moment that he broke the staff? I think that's what this means, that he broke the staff on that day. Now, it's not the Abrahamic covenant or any of Israel's unconditional covenants. No, they're still valid. And we get back to Israel being a superpower and God blessing them in the end. But this is during the time of Christ. And this is that group of people that rejected him. He came unto his own received him not. And he gives them this curse. He says, behold, your house is left unto you desolate. That's not good. That's not good at all. And so the unconditional covenants are still valid. This was the covenant of God to keep the nation Israel secure from every enemy or potential enemy. The grace of God would be suspended, and this would give opportunity for any nation to come to conquer and to devastate the nation. So it's like taking away the umbrella of protection. Now it's removed, and no longer do they have it. But they had it before. And even during Christ's day, you don't have any really record that the people were being taken over as such. There was a restraining power going on, stopping them from ultimate destruction, from the Romans, from Herodians, from the Pharisees, Sadducees. God was restraining all the people so they could do no violence to the nation. But then it was suspended. Christ declared it. He said, behold, your house is left unto you desolate. He declared it. And he said in verse 10, he's going to do that. He's going to cut it asunder. And it was broken in that day. And what day? Well, once again, I believe this is referring to Christ, his rejection by these people. They rejected him, and so he broke his covenant with them. He broke the staff beauty, and it was broken in that day. And so the poor of the flock that waited upon me knew that it was the word of the Lord. Now remember, he's feeding the poor of the flock, and the poor of the flock are the apostles. The poor of the flock are the early Christians. That's what that's referring to. So as we have seen, when Israel had their Messiah crucified, they were bringing judgment upon themselves. Christ warned them, woe unto you. He cried against them, and the poor of the flock that waited on him were the early Christians, because remember, when Christianity began, it was a Judaistic. I mean, they were people of Israel. The early Christians were Jews, and then later on, Christianity became Gentilic. Okay, but it started off as Judaistic. I mean, it was Jewish. And then the Gentiles came along, and then now you have majority Gentile Christians. We still have Christians that are Jews, thankfully, thank God for that. But as it is, and as it's been for many years, it's mainly Gentiles, which I find that to be very interesting. But it says that the poor of the flock waited on him, and these were the early Christians who knew it was the word of the Lord. And so this is incredible. I find this incredible. They knew it, and then they declared it. They declared to the people that this is what happened. So it's incredible. Yet there's so much to come. So stay tuned and do a little reading ahead if you like, because you're going to get into this 30 pieces of silver. We're going to discuss that next week. We're going to talk about that Christ was sold for 30 pieces of silver. There's the prophecy of that in Zechariah chapter 11. And then we'll get into some more. We'll talk about the Antichrist. There's a reference of that in there in chapter 11. And remember, Christ talked about that. He says, if he comes in your own name, you will follow. And then I just wanted to end this with Acts chapter 2, verse 36, where Peter, he's preaching. This is on the day of Pentecost. And listen what he says here. This is interesting. He says, therefore, let all the house of Israel know assuredly that God hath made the same Jesus whom ye have crucified, both Lord and Christ. And so the poor of the flock that waited upon me knew it was the word of the Lord. And Peter is there preaching on the day of Pentecost. And he's from the poor of the flock. He really is. And so there you have it. Zechariah, 500 years before it happened, giving us such detailed prophecy. God knows the end from the beginning. But stay tuned, because there's more, and come back next week for some more. Thank you for listening. God bless you. I'm going to sign off from the people that are listening later on. Stop recording. And then people that are here with us, just stay on and we'll do the questions. Thank you.